The silence in the hall was heavier than the embroidered gold on her dress. For Fairuz, each second dragged on like an eternity, extending the agony of waiting. This was not a wedding celebration, it was a courtroom. The air, which should have been perfumed with jasmine and joy, reeked of judgment. The fine silks that enveloped her, instead of evoking a dream, felt like a shroud, burdening her shoulders with the weight of a shame she had silently accepted. She did not expect a yes. She anticipated the cold stab of public rejection, the word that would mark her forever as unworthy, a fate she had bowed her head to, a silent sacrifice to spare her family a greater dishonor. Her downcast eyes focused on the intricate pattern of the Persian rug, but her mind saw only her brother Karim's face. He was there, somewhere in the crowd of curious and accusatory gazes. She could feel his presence, a mixture of love and contained fury burning like embers. Karim, her protector, her confidant, was now forced to witness her humiliation, and his helplessness was yet another pain in Fairuz's already shattered heart. He loved her, and that love in that moment was a torment, for he could not lift a finger to save her without destroying what little remained of their honor. She knew that inside, he was shouting, but outside, tradition kept him chained. The groom, a man whose face she barely dared to confront, finally moved. The murmuring of the guests ceased. The moment had arrived. He cleared his throat, a rough sound echoing like a death sentence. His lips parted, ready to utter the word that would shatter her into 1,000 pieces before everyone. Fairuz held her breath, bracing for impact, for the final fall. The world shrank, leaving only that sound about to be born, the word that would define her. No, but the word never came. Instead, there was a crash. The massive wooden doors of the hall swung open with violent force, slamming against the stone walls and causing the entire hall to shake. A collective shiver ran through the crowd. All heads turned, and a corridor of astonishment opened among the guests. At the entrance, outlined against the blinding desert light, he stood, Sheikh Khalid. A name, it was whispered with a mixture of fear and reverence. A leader of a neighboring clan whose reputation preceded him like a dust storm. His presence there was not merely unexpected. It was a breach of all protocol, an invasion. He advanced, and each step he took was heavy, deliberate, unquestionable. The guards in his path recoiled without him having to utter a word. His eyes, dark and piercing as the deepest night, never wavered for an instant. They remained fixed on Fairuz. He ignored the paralyzed groom, ignored the stunned elders, ignored the buzzing shock that filled the hall. His world seemed to contain only her. He stopped just a few centimeters from her, so close she could feel the warmth emanating from him, the subtle scent of leather and spices. The silence was now different. It was no longer judgmental. It was suspenseful, a paralyzing disbelief. Then, his voice echoed, not loud, but with an authority that cut through the air and caused everyone present to flinch. "This woman shall not be dishonored," he declared, and his words were not a request but a decree. He looked at the groom with icy contempt before his eyes returned to Fairuz, softening for a fraction of a second. "She will marry me." Chaos erupted into murmurs and exclamations, but Fairuz heard nothing. Her world, which seconds before was about to collapse, had been turned upside down by a man she had never seen before in her life. She raised her eyes for the first time, meeting the Sheikh's gaze. In his eyes, there was no pity. There was something deeper, something inscrutable, a storm of intentions that she couldn't comprehend. From her place, Karim observed the scene, the initial relief of seeing his sister saved rapidly replaced by a new kind of dread. He saw the Sheikh's hand extend toward Fairuz. He saw how he claimed her as his own, and at that moment, Karim realized that his sister's dishonor had not been avoided, only transferred, and that the act which saved her had just created a new, dangerous prison, a web of invisibility that now bound them, the three of them, in a love that was already born forbidden. The journey to the Sheikh's palace was a blur of silk, sand, and silence. Fairuz was led out of the banquet hall that had become her scaffold, Khalid's firm grasp on her arm not as a gesture of affection but of possession. She did not resist. Her body moved inertly, her mind still paralyzed by shock. The wave of gratitude for being saved from humiliation surged warmly within her chest, only to be immediately cooled by a freezing, paralyzing fear. She did not know this man. She knew nothing about his lands, customs, or intentions. Yes, he had saved her, but at what cost? Her family's honor had been bought, but her freedom had just been sold. When they reached the gates of the vast palace, a world of opulence unfurled before her, polished marble reflecting the night sky, fountains whispering secrets in silent courtyards, and servants bowing in reverence, their faces impassive yet their eyes brimming with ravenous curiosity. Fairuz felt hundreds of gazes cast upon her, judging her anew. She was no longer the rejected bride. Now she was the outsider, the unexpected piece on the Sheikh's power chessboard, an usurper brought by the storm. She was taken to chambers larger than her entire family's house. Luxurious fabrics, jewels shimmering under the light of silver lanterns, and a balcony overlooking a garden that seemed stolen straight from paradise. But none of it brought her comfort. On the contrary, the opulence of the place only underscored her own insignificance. This was a cage, and its bars were made of gold and silk. The loneliness that enveloped her there, in that sterile luxury, was deeper and more terrifying than any poverty she had known. Her heart ached painfully at the sight of a familiar figure standing outside her quarters. Karim. He no longer wore the festive clothes but the uniform of the Sheikh's elite guards. Their eyes met for a brief second, and in that glance, Fairuz saw a universe of pain. The relief of having him nearby was crushed by the reality of her situation. He was there to protect her but also to watch her. He was a guard serving the man who now held her sister's fate in his hands. Their physical proximity had become a torture, a constant reminder of the insurmountable divide Khalid's actions had forged between them. Karim was the first to lower his gaze, the discipline of a soldier overpowering the love of a brother. And that simple gesture shattered Fairuz's heart once more. The days that followed dragged on in a routine of silence and observation. Fairuz scarcely saw the Sheikh. He was a ghostly presence in his own palace, a shadow of authority hovering over everything. She glimpsed him from afar, settling disputes, training his men, ruling with an iron fist that left no room for doubt. His motivations remained an unfathomable mystery. Why had he chosen her? What did he see in her beyond a woman on the brink of dishonor? The initial gratitude began to erode, giving way to bitter suspicion. She had not been chosen, she had been seized. It was a consolation prize, a display of power, or, worse, the payment of an old debt of which she had no idea. The Sheikh's court was a labyrinth of rigid traditions and skewed gazes. The other women in the palace watched her with a mixture of pity and disdain. To them, Fairuz was an anomaly, a woman without kin, without dowry, without her own honor, whose only virtue was having attracted the master's attention through an inexplicable whim. Every meal was a test, every exchanged word a trap. Fairuz, who had always been strong and resilient, felt herself shrinking, her voice becoming a whisper, her presence increasingly faded. It was on one of these nights of anguish that the first crack in her gilded prison appeared. She was on her balcony, gazing at the desert under the moonlight, when Khalid emerged from the shadows. He said nothing for a long time, only stood by her side, observing the same boundless horizon. The silence between them was heavy, but different. It was not the silence of indifference, but of contemplation. "You haven't asked me why," he finally said, his voice a deep tone in the stillness of the night. Fairuz flinched, but found a spark of courage within herself. "Would the answer change these walls?" she asked, her voice steadier than she expected. An almost imperceptible smile touched the Sheikh's lips. He turned to her, and for the first time, Fairuz saw something beyond the relentless leader. She saw a flicker. Tiredness, perhaps even loneliness, flickered in his dark eyes. "Maybe not the walls," he replied, "but I could change the way you see them." He offered no further explanation. He simply stayed there for a moment longer before leaving as silently as he had arrived, leaving Fairuz with more questions than answers. That brief interaction, however, planted a seed of doubt about the man who had imprisoned her, and a seed of curiosity about the secret he kept. Meanwhile, outside, Karim listened to the muffled conversation, each word piercing his chest like a dagger. He saw the unexpected kindness of the Sheikh, saw Fairuz's strength beginning to rise from the ashes, and a poisonous jealousy started to mingle with his protective love. He served the man who had saved his sister, but every day he saw him more as a rival. a thief who had stolen not only Fairuz's freedom, but also the place Karim held in her heart. Loyalty to Khalid was his duty, but love for Fairuz was his soul, and he felt, with growing dread, that he would soon be forced to choose between the two. The triangle was closing in, and its points were as sharp as daggers. Those sharp edges began to slice through daily life, through unspoken gestures, fleeting glances that quickly averted, and rapid crossovers. The forced coexistence within the palace, more resembling a vast opulent estate nestled in the heart of the country, became the theater for a perilous dance among the three of them. For Karim, each dawn was a new test of endurance. His role as Khalid's trusted guard placed him in an unendurable proximity to the new couple. He perceived things no one else saw, minute details that tore at his soul. He observed how Khalid, the man everyone feared, left a glass of fresh water by Fairuz's bedside before her awakening, a silent gesture that spoke louder than 1,000 words. He saw how, during meals, Khalid's gaze sought Fairuz's, a fleeting second of connection invisible to the rest of the world but deafening to Karim, like thunderclaps. The torment reached its zenith on a hot afternoon at Khalid's stud farm. He decided Fairuz would learn to ride Khalid's most prized horse, an ebony thoroughbred with a wild temperament, as dark as night. Karim, standing at a respectful distance, watched with his heart pounding. He saw Fairuz's initial fear, the way she cowered before the grandeur of the beast. But then, he saw Khalid approach, not with the command of a master, but with the patience of a mentor. His hand briefly touched hers while adjusting the reins, an intimate contact that made Fairuz catch her breath. Khalid's voice was low, a murmur carried by the wind barely reaching Karim, yet he could imagine what was being said, words of encouragement and trust. And the most unbearable detail, he saw his sister, his Fairuz, relax beneath that touch. He saw the fear in her eyes give way to luminous determination. In moments, she was on the horse, uncertain but upright, and Khalid guided it around the riding ring, his body close to hers, a shield of protection. At that instant, Karim's pure and protective love was poisoned by a dark, possessive jealousy. He was no longer her protector. That role had been usurped. He was merely an observer, the guardian of his sister's happiness with another man. Meanwhile, to Fairuz, life within those golden walls ceased to be a sentence and became an enigma. The connection with Khalid grew on barren ground, a stubborn flower sprouting amidst the rocks. He did not treat her as property. He challenged her. One night, he found her in his vast library, running his fingers over the leather spines of the books. Instead of questioning her, he pulled out an old volume, a poetry book her father used to recite. "Honor isn't what others say about you," he said, opening to a bookmarked page. "It's what you do when no one's watching." Those words struck her deeply. He did not see the rejected bride. He saw the woman who accepted humiliation to protect her family. He saw a strength she didn't even know she possessed. And she, in turn, began to see the man behind the power. She noticed the fine scars on his hands, stories of battles he never spoke of. She saw the loneliness in his eyes when he thought no one was looking. A part of her, the grateful part, started to transform into something more dangerous: empathy. And empathy was the first step toward affection. However, the tension between the two men was almost tangible. Khalid seemed to test Karim constantly, not with words, but with actions. He designated him as the direct responsible for Fairuz's personal security. "I trust you more than anyone," Khalid said, and the phrase was both a compliment and a chain. Karim was forced to stay close, to watch every step, to ensure that no harm came to her. It was loyalty forged in fire. He served the man who saved his family, yet that same man was his silent rival. Every order from Khalid was a reminder of his subordinate position. Every gesture of respect from the Sheikh seemed to mark territory, to say, "She is under my protection, and you work for me." Their rivalry was not of swords but of looks, of an honor measured in silence. The web of secrets began to unravel subtly. Fairuz, feeling bolder, started to explore the palace. She wasn't seeking escape routes but answers. Why? The question still echoed in her mind. Why her? It couldn't be a whim. Men like Khalid did not act impulsively. Every move of his was calculated, like a game of chess. It was in a rarely used, dusty, forgotten office, where she found the first piece of the puzzle. Hidden at the back of a drawer, there was a small wooden box. Inside, there were no jewels or gold, but a single object, a tiny, worn rag doll with one of its button eyes missing. Fairuz felt her breath catch in her throat. She knew that doll. It was hers. The doll she had lost in a fire that devastated her family's lands years ago. A fire everyone believed was an accident. A fire that forever altered their lives. Suddenly, Khalid's involvement in the wedding no longer seemed like a random act of compassion. It appeared to be the repayment of an old and terrible debt. Her rescue was not the beginning, but the continuation of a story whose first chapter she did not know. A chilling dread ran down her spine as she realized that the man who had saved her might be directly connected to the tragedy that had initially set her on a path to dishonor. Your hands trembled as you held the small rag doll. The air in the dusty office suddenly felt thin, hard to breathe. Every detail of that battered object was a dagger stabbing at a wound she thought had healed. The missing button eye, the tiny tear in the dress her mother had sewn. It was unmistakable. That fire was no accident, and that doll, kept as a trophy or relic by Khalid, was proof. The gratitude she felt for him evaporated like smoke, replaced by a cold poison of suspicion and betrayal. She hid the doll in her clothes, her heart pounding against her ribs like a trapped bird. She needed to talk to Karim. Only he would understand the weight of that discovery. She waited until nightfall, when the guard shift change created a brief window of opportunity. She found him near the stables, his silhouette tense under the moonlight. Without a word, she pulled him into the darkness of a barn, the scent of hay and leather filling the air. "What's wrong, Fairuz?" "You shouldn't be here," he whispered, worry furrowing his brow. Instead of answering, she opened her hand. The rag doll rested in her palm, a ghost from their past. Karim looked, and for a moment, his face was blank, understanding slow to arrive. Then, his eyes widened. He reached for the doll with a terrified reverence, his fingers tracing the familiar seam. "No, it can't be," he murmured, voice choked. "Where did you find this?" "In his old office." "It was hidden." Fairuz's voice was a thin thread. Karim looked up at her, and the pain in his eyes was replaced by a cold, lethal fury that Fairuz had never seen before. Loyalty, duty, all of it unraveled in that moment. On his face, she saw only the brother she swore to protect, now realizing he was handing her over every day to the monster who might have destroyed their lives. "That bastard," Karim growled, clutching the doll so tightly his knuckles turned white. "He was there. He always knew. Our suffering, the dishonor of our family, all because of him." "We don't know that for sure, Karim," Fairuz tried to argue, though her own heart screamed otherwise. "Yes, we do," he cut her off, his voice low, perilous. "Men like him don't keep memories by coincidence. This isn't a memento, Fairuz. It's a trophy. He's playing with us, playing with you." From that day on, the dynamic in the mansion shifted. The tension, once an underground current, now manifested as a visible storm on the horizon. Fairuz was no longer the frightened and grateful bride. A new strength, born of anger and the need for answers, hardened her stance. She stopped avoiding Khalid. On the contrary, she watched him closely. During meals, her eyes studied him, dissecting every gesture, every word, searching for a crack in his facade of power. The fragile connection that had begun to form between them was poisoned by suspicion. His kindness now seemed manipulative. His words of wisdom sounded like calculated lies. She felt trapped in a web of silk, and the man who had once saved her was the very spider, patiently waiting. Khalid, perceptive as a wild animal, sensed the change. He noticed the ice in her eyes, the way she tensed subtly when he approached. One night, he confronted her in the library. "You avoid me with your eyes, Fairuz," he said, his voice calm, but with a tone that demanded an answer. "The woman I brought into this mansion is disappearing. Who is this woman replacing her?" Fairuz gathered all her courage. "Maybe she's the woman beginning to remember her past," she replied, her voice firm. "They say this land holds many stories, tales of fire and loss." Khalid's face remained a stone mask, but his eyes darkened. He took a step toward her. reducing the distance between them until she could feel the heat of his body. "Every land bears scars," he said, his voice low and intimate, "just like every family. The question isn't about the scars, Fairuz. It's about who caused them and who tried to heal them." He didn't confess anything, but he didn't deny it either. His enigmatic words were worse than a confession, for they left her floating in a sea of uncertainty, drowning in questions. She wasn't chosen. She realized painfully she was a piece in a game that had begun long before her birth. Her rescue wasn't about honor. It was about power, debt, and a secret buried beneath the ashes of his past. Meanwhile, Karim's fury was turning into a poison he swallowed every day. Being forced to protect the man he now despised was a torment that consumed him from within. Every "good morning" to Khalid, every gesture of respect, was a betrayal of himself and his sister. He became a shadow, his eyes always vigilant, no longer to protect Fairuz from external dangers but to watch the man who slept under the same roof as her. And he waited. He waited for a slip, for a word, for anything that would confirm his suspicions and give him the justification to do what his heart dictated, to free his sister from his gilded prison, no matter the cost. The opportunity Caio had been eagerly awaiting did not arrive with Vicente's slip, but rather as a fury from the heavens, a tempest, one of those that arise on the horizon and devour the landscape within minutes, descended upon the farm, isolating the grand house from the rest of the world. Rivers overflowed, bridges were swept away, and the power went out, plunging the manor into an oppressive silence, broken only by the howling wind and the lash of rain against the windows. The already heavy atmosphere became claustrophobic. Every flickering shadow cast by candlelight seemed to conceal a secret. Every dark corridor was a promise of confrontation. It was during the height of the storm that one of the old sheds, where heavy machinery was stored, began to give way under the force of the wind. A metallic crash cut through the night, and Vicente, without hesitation, shouted orders for the nearby men to follow him. Caio, out of duty, was one of them. Outside, in the muddy darkness, the two men were forced to work side by side. The rain soaked their clothes, the wind sought to knock them down, and the tension between them was more electric than the lightning splitting the sky. As they struggled to brace a metal beam threatening to collapse onto a tractor, their hands nearly touched. The brief glance they exchanged was laden with Zaimnia's silent hatred from Caio and a cold, inscrutable assessment from Vicente. "Fire cleanses the land, but water reveals what's rotten beneath," Vicente said, his voice sounding louder than the storm as he drove a stake into the mud. "Sometimes you have to destroy everything to start anew. Don't you think, boy?" The seemingly philosophical phrase struck Caio like a punch. There was no doubt in his mind. That was a confession, a cruel mockery disguised as a farmer's wisdom. The image of the fire from his childhood burned vividly in his mind, and he drove his own stake with a force that nearly shattered it. He did not respond, but his silence was a pledge of revenge. While the men were outside, Leah used the chaos to her advantage. With fewer people outside and everyone's attention focused on the storm, the house became an open field for her search. Guided by a desperate intuition, she returned to Vicente's office, the very place where she'd found the doll. This time, she didn't look in drawers, but on the tall bookcase, behind rows of books that seemed untouched for decades. Her hand found the spine of a thick leather volume, a ledger, whose yellowed pages recorded the finances of the estate from 30 years ago. With trembling hands, she leafed through it by the flickering light of a lamp, and then she saw her father's name. There was a record of an old debt, a loan taken from Vicente's father for seed purchases, and on the next page, dated a week after the fire that destroyed everything they had, was the receipt of payment. The entire debt, marked as paid, but there was no record of money. Next to it, a single word, written in firm handwriting: honor. Her world spun. That made no sense. How could her father, who had lost everything, have paid off such a massive debt? And what did that word mean? Vicente's intervention in the wedding, his rescue, it wasn't an act of power, nor even of revenge. It was the fulfillment of an ancient, silent pact. But what pact was that which demanded the sacrifice of her freedom? Her head ached under the weight of unanswered questions. She wasn't a pawn in a game of power, but the currency in a transaction of honor she didn't understand. When Vicente returned, covered in mud and exhausted, he found her in the office, the ledger open on the table. Her gaze was no longer suspicion, but a deep, painful confusion. "What is this?" she asked softly, pointing to the book. "What kind of honor debt is this that turned me into your property?" Vicente didn't move. He only looked at her, rain streaming from his hair, and for the first time, the mask of the colonel fell away, revealing a man haunted by the past. "My family's honor was also stained by that fire, Leah," he said, his voice hoarse with the emotion she'd never heard before. "You're not the only one who lost everything that night." Before he could say more, the door opened. It was Caio, coming to look for his sister. He paused in the doorway, and what he saw was the scene his hatred had already painted in his mind. Vicente, commanding and threatening, cornering his fragile sister in a dark office. He didn't hear the words, only he saw the tension, Leah's anguished face, the dangerous proximity between them. For Caio, that was the ultimate test, the confirmation. The wait was over. He stepped back into the shadows of the hallway unseen. His heart turned to a block of ice. The plan that had been forming in his mind was now sealed in blood. Later, when the storm began to calm, he found Leah in her room. Her eyes burned with feverish certainty. "Pack what you can, only the essentials," he whispered, urgency in his voice leaving no room for argument. "We're getting out of here. Tonight, no matter the cost." Leah looked at her brother's face, illuminated by a distant lightning that tore through the window. The fever in his eyes frightened her. That was not the determination of a protector. It was the obsession of a man cornered, willing to burn the world to save the only thing left to him. But she was no longer the same woman he thought he was saving. The discovery in the cash book, Vicente's enigmatic words, the genuine pain she glimpsed in his eyes, all of it had planted a seed of doubt that Caio's fury could not uproot. "Where to, Caio?" she whispered, her voice firmer than she felt. "Flee again. Spend the rest of your life looking over your shoulder. I won't run from a truth I don't even fully know." "What truth, Leah?" he retorted, grabbing her arm with a force that made her recoil. "The truth is, this man destroyed our family and now he's using you as a trophy. Can't you see he cornered you in that office, confessed everything? I saw. You saw nothing," she snapped, her voice rising. "You saw what your hatred wanted to see. There's more. Something about an honor debt." "Honor?" Caio chuckled, a bitter and broken sound. "The only honor he knows is the kind bought with power. We have nothing, Leah. The only thing we have is each other. And I won't leave you here. I won't." He started pulling her toward the door, but she planted her feet firmly on the ground. The silent struggle between them, a war of wills in the dark room, was interrupted by a calm, deep voice coming from the hallway. "She's not going anywhere with you." Vicente was standing at the door, an imposing figure silhouetted against the light of a lamp he held. He didn't look angry. He seemed tired, like a man who had carried a burden for too long. Caio turned around, placing Leah behind him, his body tense like a bowstring ready to shoot. "Stay away from her," Caio growled, instinctively reaching for his waist, where the work knife he always carried was sheathed. "Lower your hand, boy," Vicente said without taking his eyes off Leah. "This isn't your fight. It never was." "Wasn't it, Caio?" he exploded, taking a step forward. "You burned our land. You left us in poverty. You waited years to humiliate us, to take my sister as payment for a debt you yourself created. You are a monster." The air grew heavy. Leah held her breath, awaiting the denial, the surge of rage from the colonel. Instead, Vicente lowered his gaze to the ground for a moment, and when he raised it again, an old pain traced his face. "I didn't start that fire," he said softly, but each word cut through the silence. "But my father did, indirectly." Caio froze. Leah felt the ground vanish beneath her feet. Vicente continued, his voice weaving a story that time had buried. "Your father and mine were friends before they were creditor and debtor. During that drought, my father lent him money, but the harvest was poor. One of my father's overseers, a cruel man, was sent to pressure him. He went too far. The fire was meant to be a warning, a scare, but it got out of control. He paused, eyes fixed on a point in the past. My father never forgave himself. The overseer was dismissed, but the damage was done. His family lost everything. Mine lost its honor. So, they made a pact. The debt of money was forgotten, but replaced by another, an honor debt. My father swore that as long as he lived and his children after him, his family would never suffer public dishonor. If one day your name were dragged through the mud, my family would intervene, to protect, to pay for what was broken. The revelation fell over them like the wreckage of a shed in a storm. This was not revenge, it was penance. Leah's rescue at the wedding was not an act of possession, but the desperate fulfillment of a promise made by a ghost. Protect? Kaio spat the word like venom. You call that protection? Locking her in here? Making her your prisoner? I saved her the only way I knew how? Vicente's voice finally broke, calm giving way to deep frustration. I saved her from humiliation, from ruin, and yes, I brought her here, under my roof, because it was my duty, because I looked at her and saw not the daughter of my father's debtor. I saw the strongest woman I have ever known, accepting hell to save everyone, and I couldn't bear it. The confession hung in the air, raw and unexpected. He wasn't looking at Kaio. He was speaking directly to Leah, his eyes pleading for her to understand the complexity of his imprisonment. Leah took a step forward, moving out from behind her brother. The two men fell silent, turning toward her. She was the eye of that whirlwind of secrets and duties. One offered her escape, a family love that suffocated her with protection. The other offered security, a gilded cage built upon generations of guilt, yet paradoxically where she was beginning to find her own strength. She looked at her brother, his face contorted with pain and confusion. Then, she glanced at Vicente, the powerful colonel, now exposed and vulnerable because of the truth, and for the first time, she did not see a victim to be saved or a prize to be won. She saw herself. Enough, she said, her voice clear and unwavering, silencing the storm within and outside the house. Both of you, enough. My honor is not a debt to be paid. My life is not a territory to be protected. It does not belong to your father Vicente's past, nor to your fear, Kaio. She paused, taking a deep breath, feeling the power of her own voice for the first time. From now on, it belongs to me. The silence that followed her words was louder than the storm's peak. The two men, both poles of her universe, looked at her as if seeing her for the first time. Kaio, his eyes clouded with confusion and fury. Vicente, with an inscrutable expression, an amalgam of shock and something dangerously close to admiration. It was Kaio who broke the spell, his voice hoarse with incredulity. Leah, what are you saying? You can't believe him. He's manipulating you, poisoning you against me, against our family. Leah turned to her brother, and for the first time, her reflection was not that of a protector but of a cage, constructed with love and fear. She took a step toward him, her hands open in a gesture of supplication, not weakness. No, Kaio, he didn't poison me. You're the one who's sick with that hatred you've carried for years. You love me. I know that better than I know my own name. But your love has become a chain. You weren't fighting to save me. You were fighting not to lose the last thing you had left in this world. Each word was a gentle yet precise blow. She saw the pain blossom on his face, understood the struggle between him and the years of anger that had become his identity. You didn't ask me what I wanted, she continued, her voice trembling but firm. You decided for me, decided I was fragile, that I was a victim. But that victim from the fire died long ago, Kaio. I survived, and you need to let me live. Heartbroken for having to hurt her brother to heal herself, she turned to Vicente. The colonel hadn't moved, his gaze fixed on her, awaiting her verdict. And you, she said, and the fire returned to her voice. You speak of honor, but you used mine as a shield for yours. The debt your father incurred cannot be repaid with someone else's freedom. You didn't save me from humiliation, Vicente. You simply exchanged my public dishonor for your private penance. She walked over to the table where the rag doll still rested, a small body of cloth that carried the weight of two families. She picked it up. You kept this, she said, raising just the translated text in NUS. I'm not your prisoner. If I stay in this house, it won't be as payment, nor as someone protected. It will be as a free woman, someone who chooses where to step, who to speak to, and whom to give her heart to. She turned her back on the two of them, walking toward the door. She wasn't fleeing. She was giving them a choice. The choice to accept her on her own terms, or lose her forever. As she paused at the threshold, she spoke without turning around, her voice as clear as the sky after a storm. The storm outside is over. Now you need to decide which storm you want to calm down in here. And with that declaration, she was gone, leaving behind a vacuum that sucked all the air out of the corridor. The two men stood there, not as rivals, but as shipwrecked sailors on the shore of an unknown island. Leah's storm having been far more devastating than the one battering the farm. Caio looked at Vicente, anger in his eyes now clouded by a confused ache. The certainty that had guided him for so long, the rage that was his fuel, had dissipated. He no longer had a monster to fight, only a tired man and a sister who refused to be saved. The realization hit hard and cruel. He wasn't protecting Leah, he was suffocating her. His private war had made her a prisoner, just as much as Vicente's debt. Without a word, he turned away, not to follow Leah, but to walk in the opposite direction, toward the house door, toward the faint rain falling outside. He needed air. He needed to distance himself from the ghost of the man he had become. Vicente watched Caio walk away and then looked at the empty corridor where Leah had disappeared. The colonel, the man who controlled lands and destinies, had been disarmed by a single woman. The debt of his father, which he had carried like a cross all his life, had been burned in that fireplace. And instead of guilt, a new and frightening feeling began to emerge. Hope. The next morning, the sun rose timidly, washing over the farm and painting the sky with colors of renewal. Leah did not run away. Caio did not leave. A different silence settled in the house, not one of tension but of anticipation. It was Leah who took the first step. She went down for breakfast and found Vicente alone at the table. She sat down, poured herself some coffee, and the silence between them was that of two nations renegotiating their borders. "This year's grain harvest will be weak because of the rain," she said, her voice calm and practical. "But the pasture will recover quickly. We should invest in more cattle." Vicente lifted his gaze from his plate, surprised. She wasn't talking about the past, about debts, or about them. She was talking about the future, about the land, and for the first time he smiled, not the smile of a colonel, but a story about a man who finds an unexpected partner. "It's a good idea," he replied. "The cash book is in the office. Do the calculations, see what we can do." That was the beginning. Leah didn't become the lady of the estate. She became the soul. She dove into the business, learned about the land with a hunger that surprised everyone. Her strength, once used to resist, was now used to build. Caio watched her from afar at first. The protective brother still lived within him, but he was learning to trust. Gradually, he started to see the woman Leah had become. He saw the respect the farmhands had for her, not because she was the boss's protege, but because of her smart and fair decisions. One day, he approached her in the corral. "You seem happy?" he said, his voice still tinged with gentle melancholy. "I'm not happy, Caio," she replied, never taking her eyes off the horizon. "I'm whole, for the first time in my life." He nodded, and in that moment, the last remnants of the hatred consuming him dissipated, carried away by the wind. He found his own place, no longer as her guardian, but as her right hand, the trusted man helping her transform the farm. The forbidden love, that triangle of pain and secrets, dissolved. What remained was something more complex and far more real. Caio's love for Leah purified itself, returning to be the unbreakable bond of family, now rooted in admiration. And the relationship between Leah and Vicente became a silent partnership, a dance of mutual respect and an attraction that needed no labels or promises. They were two souls who had found, in each other, not salvation, but recognition. Leah learned that true honor was not something to be protected or paid for. It was the courage to be the author of one's own story, to take the ashes of the past and use them to nourish the soil of the future. And on that land, once scarred by the fire of debt and the storm of secrets, she finally planted her own garden. If this journey through the complex phases of honor, love, and sacrifice resonated with you? Share your thoughts in the comments. We want to know what you would do in Leah's place. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel and turn on the notifications for more stories that explore the depths of the human heart.